All right, Yokoso, welcome back. Um, today's seminar, 今日は、このセミナーは、英語だけです。ごめんなさい。And additionally, this is not intended for the translators. Um, this is a seminar from September 2023. And as I create new seminars, there's a lot of old material that doesn't I don't do anything with, so we're gonna go through it today. I apologize for the goatee, but later this month I'm doing a cosplay that requires it. So today we'll be discussing single reference obviousness rejections. We'll begin by looking at the idea of prior art. We'll talk briefly about inherency. The original seminar went through several MPEP rationales, but today we'll just look at rearrangement of parts. Then we'll look at a non-MPEP rationale, and then, of course, we'll do some case studies. So like all art rejections, single reference obviousness rejections begin with the prior art. However, unlike a typical art rejection, single reference obviousness rejections require the examiner to admit the prior art is insufficient to teach all claim limitations, right? This makes sense. If the prior art taught all of the claim limitations, then the examiner would have made an anticipation rejection. And so, from the examiner's point of view, the prior art teachings are inconveniently different from applicants' claims. So in single reference obviousness rejections, examiners often minimize their reliance on the prior art, right? They incorrectly believe that by minimizing these teachings or their reliance on these teachings, they have more flexibility to modify the prior art. When we do interviews with examiners on these types of issues, they frequently say, oh, well, I'm not relying on it for the more detailed features. So to rebut these modifications, applicants' representatives must make technical arguments usually, not usually a legal argument. Um, and the reason is that the examiner wants us to skip over the prior art, right? He doesn't want us to conduct a detailed review because he knows that prior art is insufficient. So the advice is please don't let him do that. After we consider the teachings of the prior art, we also must consider the prior art's inherent teachings. Okay. This isn't quite obviousness, but sometimes it is. Inherency is a theory by which examiners can support a rejection of a missing claim element without additional documentary evidence, right? What's a pretty clear example? A patent to a pencil for cleaning fingernails was held invalid over a pencil of the same structure for writing because the prior art pencil inherently could perform the cleaning functions, right? It was already part of it. Therefore, although the writing pencil wasn't described as performing the cleaning function, it still possessed that. That was still inherent to the teachings of the prior art pencil. In relying upon the theory of inherency, the examiner must provide a basis in fact and or technical reasoning to reasonably support the determination that the allegedly inherent characteristic necessarily flows from the teachings of the applied prior art. And I apologize in advance, but I'll be reading a lot of lengthy text today, but hopefully not a lot of MPEP. So to illustrate how something is not inherent, we generally argue the characteristic sometimes is not present, right? It has to always be present. for the examiner to make a good inherency argument. And even if the examiner does not mention inherency in a single reference obviousness rejection, we always should consider it, right? We don't want to make an ineffective argument. And maybe, and in fact, usually we argue it. It's just a way of making sure the examiner knows where we're at. Examiners are often surprised when I do it. And then when they see all of the arguments, then they say, oh, that's why he argued inherency first. So now that we're considering rationales rather than the disclosure of the prior art and its inherent teachings, we move to MPEP 2144. This section lists many common rationales outlining when things are or are not obvious. So this is basically just a table of contents. It's got all of the different rationales listed as well as their location. We're not going to use all of them today, so we're not going to cover all of them today. We are going to touch on rearrangement of parts briefly. Here, the MPEP says it is obvious to rearrange the placement of parts, absent modifying the operation of the device. This is a so-called design choice rejection. We're actually not going to do this today, but usually we argue how the claim element produces an advantage. I often say how Americans don't argue inventive effect in their office action responses because it creates estoppel. But this is the one time we have to do it, actually. In addition to the MPEP rationales, there are also non-MPEP rationales. The one that we'll be using today or will be addressing is about combining embodiments of a reference. Usually there is a reason why the embodiments in a reference are separated, right? They might involve mutually exclusive decisions, right? Maybe we've got some sort of device, and in one embodiment, the beam is parallel to another structure, and in a different embodiment, it's perpendicular. Other times, the embodiments address different problems or solutions. And in this situation, applicants often can make good technical arguments about why the embodiments should not be combined. As a group, single reference obviousness rejections are typically overcome with technical arguments. Again, that's not always the case, but that's a bit different than our normal practice. And that is generally the way. One type of argument in this regard is what the art teaches, contrasted to what the applicant's claim does. Another type of argument is inventiveness. For example, the advantage, which, as I mentioned, practitioners otherwise generally avoid arguing at the USPTO. So let's do some case studies. I'm going to do a biological case after a lot of pressure. I'm going to do a mechanical case and an electrical case today. So our first case study is a cell population comprising mesenchymal stem cells. So here's where we begin the lengthy reading, and I apologize for the complicated English. Mesenchymal stem cells have the ability to secrete cytokines that promote angiogenesis. Thus, it has been reported that treatment of cardiac failure may be attained by transplanting cell sheets containing mesenchymal stem cells. Mesenchymal stem cells derived from a fetal appendage have been found to be a heterogeneous cell population comprising various cells, having different differentiation capacities, proliferative capacities, and cytokine-producing capacities. For producing a stable quality of cell preparation, it is necessary to prepare a purified, highly homogeneous cell population. Basically, we want to treat heart attacks with cells from a placenta. And, we have some problems when we do that. So what's our invention? A cell population comprising cells collected from the fetal appendage contains mesenchymal stem cells that are CDH6 positive and highly express the ADAM19 gene. And cell populations comprising mesenchymal stem cells having the above cell characteristics highly express particular genes, encoding angiogenesis-related cytokines and having high angiogenic capacity. I'm not going to read the names of those genes. So, by using a positive rate of CDH6 and expression of ADAM19 gene as indices, we can identify stem cells expressing genes having high angiogenic capacity, right? We can't directly measure angiogenic capacity, I guess. I don't know. But we can instead look at these two things and determine it. So, of course, in this type of situation, we're going to need some data so we can see that the cell population of our example has a high CDH6, whereas the comparative example has a low cell population. Our example has a relative expression level as compared with the comparative example. And then we come over here and we see that our relative expression level of these important genes is much better in our example cell population than with the comparative example. So how are we claiming it? We're looking at independent claim 16 here. I'm just going to go ahead and read this one. It says a cell population comprising mesenchymal stem cells, the cell population having the following cell characteristics A and B. A is the proportion of CDH6 positive mesenchymal stem cells is 30% or more in the cell population. And B is the relative expression level of ADAM19 gene to the expression level of SDHA gene is 3.0 or more in the cell population. And then there are other dependent claims, but I'm just going to look at 17 and 21. 17 being that the cell population is cultured or cryopreserved, 21 being a pharmaceutical composition comprising this cell population in a pharmaceutically acceptable vehicle. So what is the rejection here? Well, the examiner kind of gives this whole explanation first. He says the instant claims are interpreted as the MSCs, the mesenchymal stem cells, isolated from a fetal appendage based on the disclosure of the examples in the instant application. And then he rejects the claims as anticipated or obvious over Umezawa. And Umezawa is this very long, complicated reference, but he's only relying on it for like a single sentence. And that sentence says cells capable of differentiating into a cardiac muscle cell originate in mesenchymal stem cells isolated from an appendage of a fetus. And then the examiner admits that while Umezawa et al. Do not particularly teach the percentage of CDH6 positive MSCs in the cell population, and the relative expression level of ADAM19 gene being 3 or more compared to SDHA gene, it is an inherent feature of the MSCs isolated from a fetal appendage according to the instant examples. Okay. He's really not relying on Umezawa for much. He's saying that, Umezawa gives the basic idea, and the MSCs inherently have this feature. And then the examiner continues. He says, the instant specification shows two cell populations, right? We showed those, comparative example 1 and example 1. And those two populations are prepared from two different donors using an identical isolation procedure. Absolutely true. Since there's no particular distinction between these two cell populations other than two different donors, it is expected that some donors for the MSCs would possess the claimed features, whereas some donors would not. That's not quite right, but it's close enough. Thus, considering the heterogeneity of donors, it is expected that one skilled in the art would obtain the MSC population from a fetal appendage satisfying the claimed features from certain donors, and thus it would meet the claimed cell population. Alternatively, it would have been obvious that a MSC population from a certain donor would have the identical features / characteristics as claimed. Okay. The examiner is really confusing would and could here, which is kind of important. But basically, the examiner is trying to incorporate comparative example 1 into the prior art. Okay, that's what he's trying to do. He's giving all these reasons. But applicant's comparison, right, this whole, our example versus the comparative example, is not against the prior art. The comparison is against an unidentified cell population, right? It's how do we identify these cell populations? So, as I mentioned, I like to argue inherency first. Though actually it's a little out of order in this case. First, I want to say that it is not inherent that isolated MSCs possess the claimed features. Indeed, comparative example 1 shows that it is not inherent. Okay, inherent means always. We know that this is not always the case. Comparative example 1 makes this point. And people say, Brian, I want to see the actual arguments that you would put in your response. This is it. This isn't just the idea. These are the words I would write in the remarks. Usually, we argue inherency after the reference, right? First, we discuss the reference, and then we talk about what's inherent. Here, because the inherency is based on the examiner's assertion of inherency is based on our application rather than Umezawa, I suggest arguing it first, right? Let's get rid of inherency because the inherency is allegedly based on our own application, and then we'll address the prior art. And so to address a single reference obviousness rejection, we want to begin by looking at anticipation usually, right? We have to make the point that it doesn't anticipate so that we can then follow up and say, by the way, it's not obvious either. Because if it does anticipate, that would make it a good single reference obviousness rejection. So Umezawa does not disclose a cell population having characteristics A and B, right? Of course not. Like he's relying on it for a single sentence. It doesn't have that detail. Umezawa merely describes obtaining MSCs from a totally different process. Nothing in the Umezawa process suggests it will produce a cell population having characteristics A and B. Now we turn to obviousness, and we say, indeed, Umezawa is silent regarding CDH6 positive mesenchymal stem cells and ADAM19 gene. Thus, it is impossible to conclude it would have been obvious to modify the Umezawa process of isolating mesenchymal stem cells from a fetal appendage to achieve characteristics A and B. All right, maybe you don't feel like argue. I'd probably argue this one. But maybe you don't want to I don't know, you want to move prosecution forward very efficiently. So what are some amendments, right? Well, we only know that our cell population has characteristics A and B after our process, right? So the examiner actually might have a point that some Umezawa cell populations have characteristics A and B. I don't know the technology well enough to know that, to say that they couldn't have those characteristics. So what if I want to amend? Maybe I will amend the claim to say an isolated cell population, right? Umezawa teaches isolating a different cell population. It doesn't teach isolating a cell population having characteristics A and B. Likewise, we can consider amending independent claim 16 based on dependent claim 17 or 21. He clearly does not have these features, but I would like to make the point that you still need to present arguments here, right? You cannot amend only. You will have to present arguments like the ones on the previous slides to make the point that, that that we are doing something different, even if we are amending. All right, case study number 2. This is a magnetic encoder. By the way, I think all of these cases were abandoned. So conventionally, to produce a magnetic encoder, a plurality of magnetic tracks are sequentially magnetized. A magnetic track that has been magnetized first is assumed to be reduced in accuracy due to leakage of a magnetic flux when a subsequent magnetic track is magnetized. Therefore, it is difficult to magnetize with high accuracy all of the magnetic tracks. In the case where the magnetic track main track is magnetized first, when the other magnetic track subtrack is magnetized thereafter, leakage of a magnetic flux may cause reduction in accuracy of the main track. However, in the present invention, since the main track is magnetized last, reduction in accuracy of the main track is inhibited, whereby an absolute angle can be detected with high accuracy. Basically, we're switching the order in which these tracks are magnetized. This patent application was filed with 3 independent claims. One is to the encoder, one is to the method for producing the encoder, and the third is to the apparatus for producing the encoder. Here, the applicant elected the encoder claims for prosecution, not the method and apparatus for producing the encoder. And so we cannot claim the order in which the tracks are magnetized, right? The order can be claimed in the other 2 independent claims, right? It's very easy to write a method claim in a particular order. It's a little bit more difficult, but it's not a big challenge to write an apparatus claim that produces things in a certain order. But here, the encoder is the same, right? It's just magnetized in a different order. So how do we do that? We want to claim the encoder based on the achieved accuracy, right? We want to functionally claim the difference in the structure produced by this magnetization order, because it's, the encoder is just a thing. You can't say it's encoded in here. It's magnetized in a particular order. So here's the claim. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I am going to point out this bottom part that says the accuracy of the pitch of the magnetic poles is higher in the main track than in the subtrack. Okay, that's the important part here. So what's the rejection? It's based on the Takahashi reference. And that teaches that the accuracy of the pitch of the magnetic poles is higher in the main track than in the subtrack, by virtue that in figure 47b, subtrack 32 has 1 pole, therefore no pitch. See paragraph 223. Okay. But the examiner acknowledges that Takahashi in figure 47b is silent about a subtract used for calculating a phase difference from the main track. Okay, he's telling you he doesn't have that feature I highlighted. And then he says that in another embodiment, Takahashi teaches a subtract used for calculating a phase difference from the main track. Okay, now he's looking at figure 2. And so here, I want to make the point that the examiner is, these citations are good for what he's relying on them for. The issue is that, the combination doesn't teach the reference doesn't teach the combination. And even if it did, like, it wouldn't be combined the way he's proposing. But the individual reliance is good. So what are my proposed arguments? Well, first I would explain that according to the portion of Takahashi accompanying 47b, figure 47b, the second track 32 may be formed as a track for index signal Z-phase generation, comprising a magnetic pole for detection of a rotation reference position. Okay. I'm not gonna. It's been a year since I've looked at this. I don't really remember the technical details. I'm not going to go into it. It's not so important because this is more what we're discussing. Okay, even assuming Takahashi shows in Figure 2, right, the second embodiment that he relies on, a subtrack used for calculating a phase difference from the main track, the functionality of the Figure 2 second track cannot simply be added to the structure of the Figure 47b second track, right? That's what the examiner is doing. He's saying, I'm just going to take out the function from Figure 2 and put it into Figure 47b. It is precisely because the structure of the Figure 47b second track differs from the structure of the Figure 2 second track that it has a different function of detecting a rotation reference position rather than calculating a phase difference. Okay. The examiner is like, these are two completely different embodiments. He's saying, oh, well, I'm relying on this for detecting the rotation reference position. Again, that's correct, but it's because it's structured differently that it can do that. And then he's relying on Figure 2 for this additional feature, but like Figure 2 is built very differently, so you can't just make that substitution. Further, Takahashi Figure 2 does not disclose or suggest that accuracy of pitch of the magnetic poles is higher in the main track than in the subtrack. Okay. Additionally, by substituting the structure of Figure 2 for Figure 47b, the office's rationale for rejecting this feature, right? The examiner had said subtract 32 has one pole, therefore no pitch, would no longer apply because the Figure 2 second track does not have no pitch, right? The Figure 2, sorry, I'm going to go back to show you. Figure 2 doesn't have only one pole, right? We see all these poles here. If you have more than one pole, you have a pitch. You can't have a pitch if you're going to, I'm sorry, you have to have a pitch if you're going to rely on Figure 2. That's the examiner's error. This is what I mean by presenting very technical arguments. You really have to like get into the details of it and explain to the examiner why it wouldn't have been obvious based on the art. All right, case study 3. This is a comparator and A to D converter. So our application begins by discussing this reference to Sakakibara. This is the closest prior art described in our application. And this discloses an imaging device, including a comparator, including a positive feedback circuit used for increasing the transition rate when an output signal is inverted. Okay. In this conventional comparator, however, a malfunction may occur due to variation of element characteristics or the like. Thus, when an A to D conversion circuit is formed using such a comparator, an A to D conversion error may occur. Okay, that's the problem that in Sakakibara. Here's what we're doing. On the right side of the slide, you can see the claim. I've annotated it in colors. On the left side, you can see our Figure 3, which is what we're claiming broadly. Again, it's annotated with different colors. We'll talk more about it in a minute. So the examiner relies on the Sakakibara reference, actually, in making the rejection. And I believe this one was a woman. So she says that based on applicants Figure 3 and 4a, and the structure Sakakibara teaches in Figure 3, Sakakibara transistor 86 and voltage converting circuit 61 would be equivalent to the applicant's amplifier circuit. The only difference that the examiner can see is that the instant application teaches that the structure 34B, the claimed amplifier unit, includes transistor MP3 as well as the structure for the current source 38. Sakakibara teaches that the equivalent transistor 86, right, equivalent to MP3, is denoted with the differential unit 61 via dashed lines. So let's look at it, okay? And the examiner makes an outstanding point, right? You can see, right, here, this red portion is a combination of the green and blue portions. This is our invention. And you can see that's true over here in Sakakibara figure 3, right? The red portion is a combination of green and blue. We both have this third portion that's yellow. And the only difference that the exam, you can see that MP3 here in ours moves over to the green one in Sakakibara, but that is not a meaningful difference. And then we've got this difference of this transistor here, 38, or item 38. And you can see that they have this transistor 91 here. Okay, that's the only difference. So the examiner considers that the circuits are all integrated circuits, and the applicant decision to indicate a particular transistor within a larger functional group would be considered a design choice, or even more so, a matter of notation. The decision to illustrate the transistor MP3 as part of the amplifier unit 34B does not provide for any unpredictable results, because the operation of the device is the same as if it were included within the dashed line of the differential unit 34A. It has been held that the combination of familiar elements, according to known methods, is likely to be obvious when it does not do more than yield predictable results. So this is a reasonable rejection. I mean, she's right. So what options are available for amending? Well, that's where it starts getting complicated. In early 2022, the examiner issued a restriction requirement. An applicant elected claims 1 through 4 for prosecution. Okay, so we could only choose the subject matter that's covered by these claims. So the first thing I want to do is look at claim 2, dependent claim 2, and this clarifies, what the first current source load 38. I mean, that's clearly very important. So like we're going to focus our attention on the claim that has that. Well, what did the applicant do? So you can see that they made this amendment, right? They have the first transistor in purple. They've got the first current source in orange. And they argue that the Sakakibara transistor 91 is not a current source. The amendment did overcome the rejection we're looking at, but the examiner simply added a new reference, Nakajima, for the current source. All right, well, what would you do, Brian? Well, first, I'm going to look at my application. And you can see we've got these 3 different embodiments for the current source load. Right, we've got figure 4A, 4B, 4C. And we can see that, claim 3 has the second transistor MN6 that are shown in figures 4A and 4B. And for claim 4, it has this bias hold capacity. I'm sorry, claim 4B is covered by claim 4. It includes this bias hold capacitor CBH. Okay. That's the difference between 3 and 4, as well as figures 4A and 4B. We also have this figure 4C that shows that it can just be a resistor. That's not important for the claims, but we will discuss it momentarily. So we can see that, this is probably a good amendment, right? These 2 structures are different than equivalent, or not equivalent, but applied transistor 91 from Sakakibara, right? They're very different structures. They work differently. We just have to find a way to claim it. Here's my proposal. It's pretty lengthy. But the important part, of course, is that pink transistor. And so we're going to say, there's a second transistor Mn6 whose first main node is connected to the second node and whose second main node is connected to the second voltage node. And then it continues. Okay. I'm not going to read this whole thing. Brian, you have so much experience. Okay. You say you have a master's degree concentrated in circuits, right? Still, applicant's amendment is much broader than your amendment. An applicant's amendment was successful, right? It overcame this rejection. So why can't you accept that? First, I am not sure the amendment should overcome Sakakibara, right? I absolutely agree. Sakakibara does not explicitly disclose a current source. However, our figure 4C, whoops, let me go find it. Here, figure 4C, here's this resistor to ground. We're going to talk about that now. Is evidence that a passive current source, for example, a resistor to ground, is sufficient. So can't Sakakibara transistor 91 be characterized as having a resistance to ground? Yes, of course. Wouldn't such a resistance also be a passive current source like applicant's figure 4C? Is that what an applicant intended? No. Is that a reasonable rejection? I mean, I sure think so. We definitely characterize that sort of thing in school. So my suggestion then is to broadly cover figures 4A and 4B, and that's what I'm trying to do. And I want to point out something about this amendment. I'm trying to stay very deferential to my client here. I'm imagining that this is a client of mine. It's not. Because I don't know their policy, right? Different clients have different preferences. Some say, Brian, just write it the way you would like to write it. Others say, we want it to look a certain way. That's why we drafted our claims that way. Obviously, I can write this a different way if I want to. But here I'm trying to show that I can work with a client that, um, doesn't want me changing their claims very much. So this is, very deferential amendment. Brian, have you not seen this Nakajima reference? Nakajima clearly shows a current source in a similar location. So do you deny that a known way to implement a current source is a transistor, like applicant's transistor Mn6, right? Nakajima shows a current source. We know current sources can be transistors, so like, why wouldn't you do that? So I'm not saying such a substitution could not be made, right? Applicant made exactly such a substitution. So of course, someone else could make such a substitution, right? That's not the case law. That's not the law. Nakajima does not disclose that the current source is implemented as such a transistor. So the examiner should provide another reference showing that it is obvious to implement a current source as a transistor in that location. Okay. I mean, maybe she can. That's fine. We'll do something else. But I think that this is enough for now, right? Even knowing that Nakajima's out there, I think this is enough. I would want to see evidence to make that modification, right? I, it's a question of what are the teachings of Sakakibara? What are the, right, where it has the circuit that it shows? What are the inherent teachings of Sakakibara, where I'm suggesting that there's a resistance to ground inherently, because that's the real world. And things that might be logical, it might even be a reasonable substitution. But, I need to see that. I need to see the specific rejection that the examiner makes. And that's what this is with Nakajima, is I need to see that. Maybe it's not obvious to use a transistor as the current source here for some reason. I don't know. until I see the reference. I mean, I know a little bit about this stuff. So that concludes today's seminar. We talked about the prior art, the role of prior art in single reference, obviousness, rejections. We talked about inherency. We showed some MPEP rationales, notably including design choice, which we used in that last example. We talked about non-MPEP rationales like combining embodiments that we saw in the second example. And then we did some case studies, right? Inherency, combining embodiments, and design choice. That concludes it. Thank you so much. Hope to see you again soon.